10 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to speak here. And as Mrs. Mary Dajewski said, indeed, it's a problematic issue. The terminology issue is not so much with democracy, but with liberalism. And so my presentation will deal with that. But as a response to what Mr. David Engels said, let me start with a quote from Roger Scruton and about Poland, because Mr. Engels said the future does not belong perhaps to nation states. Sir Scruton says the nation state is the condition of Europe, the most settled way of representing to the people the notion of allegiance. Such is the fierceness of man's attachment to what he regards as his own, that a society may endure conquest and occupation. Consider Poland, overcome again and again by rival powers, yet resolute in the defense of its identity, aided by the Church of Rome. Here are 3 points. First of all, the relevance of the nation state in Europe. Second is patriotism, that Scruton calls allegiance to a nation state, which makes people overcome the vicissitudes of history, and he takes Polish people as an example, and the connection between patriotism, national identity, Christian faith, in Poland, of course, the Catholic Church. And Scruton exposes the absurdities of secularist ideology. He says the withdrawal of religion withers transcendent social bonds. Christianity, he says, was part of the common way of seeing things. The destruction of its dogmas and rituals has left a vacuum. Secularization hinders the social bonds, so it is politically necessary to fight secularization. And he says the restoration of the church may become a serious political cause. So nation, patriotism, identity, Christian church, these are conservative values, and for which you may call me illiberal, by the way of the word liberal in liberal democracy. These values were precisely the values which were abandoned by liberal democracy, and I would say that, like a genetically modified organism, liberal democracy has suffered mutations. It ceased to be what it used to be initially. In its march after the collapse of communism, liberalism was globalized and in the process turned into a mutant. So that meant erosion of the sovereignty of national states. They were integrated into national bodies like the IMF, the World Bank, the European Union, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations. So they began to lose their right to self-determination. Now, I belong to a conservative party, and that's why I could compare our party with Law and Justice, with Prawo and Sprawiedliwość, which is our model. Like peace, we are sovereignists, and we want, like peace, a Europe of nations, not a European superstate. I will split these aspects into cultural and economic aspects. From a cultural point of view, liberal democracies has adopted biased assumptions of the radical left revolutionary ideology. Some people call it political correctness. Liberal democracy has been infected by the virus of political correctness and has become a global pandemic. Patriotism and Christian identity have been systematically deconstructed on ideological criteria and eliminated from Western liberal democracies, and in this way their foundational elements were removed. Transcendence has been forbidden in the public space. Based on false assumptions, the elites try to forge an identity centered on so-called human rights and secular values. What they got is a simulacrum expressing actually nobody, a fake in which people cannot recognize themselves. In a world with no anchor in the transcendent, God has been replaced by the state and morality replaced by politics, as Georg Hegel said 200 years ago. The state loses legitimacy and becomes a mere choice of a political lifestyle. So the state has no more moral authority, but just the authority of force, exercising ideological coercion with no moral ground. And that is what happened with liberal democracies. Hegemony of secularism, a theophobic culture intolerant to Christians. The state has become a secular fundamentalist state, which is very serious. Religion reduced to a moral heuristic in an entropic, disenchanted world, and man has become massified, lobotomized, flattened, annihilated, abolished, a consumer and a merchandised at the same time. The new globalized man, called postmodern man, recent man as well, minimal self, as Christopher Lasch calls him, ticklish subject, Zizek, happy slave, garbage can man, has been reduced to a vegetative survival like happy dogs lying in the sun, as Fukuyama famously said. A puppet happy to exist on the horizontal plateau, as Gilles Deleuze calls him. As to God, God is dead, as Hegel announced in 1802, or is in an eclipse, as Martin Buber said, but he has been evacuated from society. As the Polish people knows, the battle for sovereignty also has a spiritual side, the battle for God. That's the problem with liberal democracies. They are today torn by cultural wars and bioethical battles. These bioethics, grounded in traditional Christian morality, are a rift along which cultural tectonic plates collide, and they are perceived by the secularist establishment as fundamentalist threats to the dominant ethos. We have conflict between traditional family versus right of sexual minorities or LGBT, gender ideology, and these are postmodern battlegrounds. The COVID pandemic is also a new battlefield between traditionalist and globalist movements. The biopolitics has triumphed. We see an invasion of the body, biological totalitarian control, and a new pharma political correctness has evolved. This is repressive tolerance, as Marcuse used to call it. Now, from the economic point of view, liberal democracies turn to neoliberalism and market fundamentalism, adopting the neoliberal manifesto called the Washington Consensus, with its well-known dogmas, opening markets, liberalizing imports, eliminating tariffs, deregulation, privatization. So these policies, of course, are not in the interest of developing nations. And these economic problems are also a reason for the failure of liberal democracies. The free market is famously unstable, deregulation leads to financial instability, and we saw that in the 2008 Great Depression. Confidence in the laissez-faire policies has collapsed. But neoliberalism has survived after 2008 financial meltdown. Its dogmas are still applied. Neoliberalism is a corporate takeover of the market. Neoliberal hegemony results in corporatization of the planet and the neoliberal market rationality. The neoliberal discourse has taken over. So today's world order is resulting from the neoliberal globalization formula is dysfunctional.
Up to conclusion.
Yes. So the problem is that this is the end. We are seeing technocratic elites in Brussels, which have a certain neoliberal monopoly and an oligarchy. And instead of a cure for all ills, politically correct neoliberalism has changed its paradigm, becoming a source of ills. We must preserve its democratic tradition, but we must oppose its current pathologies, trying to delete Christian faith and morality, and we see cancel culture and woke culture. So these are the problems with liberal democracies, and that's why we can speak about the requiem for it. However, because you mentioned Hungary, some even say that this is the future. So the Hungarian Prime Minister said, no, conservatism is not backward, but maybe this is the future of Europe and not what the elites are claiming.
Serdecznie dziękuję. Teraz żałuję,